Our third speaker today is Professor Keith Engel, Chief Executive Officer of the South African Institute of Taxation. Many of you know him, and Keith, it's a pleasure to welcome you back.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the re-invite. Obviously, I wasn't too offensive in the last one, so we'll see where we are. Now, this was a funny one because you kind of gave me, an indication of what you wanted to talk about. I don't know if you want to hear about the history of my life. I can tell you about 2 divorces and how I prevailed. I can tell you all sorts of crazy office battles that I've had. I don't think we want to torture you with all of that. Again, that's for the. I do plan to write a book on, 2 divorces will be my book on Netflix. But being that as it may, I've had a very strange life, and I feel very lucky about it. But my fortunes really have come because I started out in the U.S., and then I went to South Africa, and now I went back to the U.S., but now I'm being pulled back here. So that's why the narrative is I'm here, I'm back, and I'm here again. So where the hell am I? So whenever I come, people go, thought you were gone, now you're back, okay, where are you going? So but from the story, why that's important is it's a bit of a journey about immigration and expats, right? And that's what you guys talk about. And I'm going to tell you more from my perspective of how I've seen the regulatory landscape change in terms of my own life, and also in terms of my experience. So that's the reason I'm not just boring you with my lifestyle, because when you get old, you like to tell the young people about your life, and they don't want to hear about it. So that's just the way it is. So the point is this. I started out in the U.S. I did the standard thing. I'm a tax lawyer. I worked in Washington, D.C., all the plans were normal. I went and worked in the Internal Revenue Service, a lot of friendly people there. Our revenue service is a little different, but people don't like them anyway. As I said, nothing personal, but if you work for the Internal Revenue Service, nobody wants to invite you for the Sunday bride. That's just the way it is. Doesn't matter which one, that's all there is to it. And you can try to disassociate. I did that, then I worked in a law firm, and then I was an academic. So we went round and round, and one reason why I was an academic is I like to talk forever, and you've got students who are held captive and they have to listen. So I did that for a while, and what happened was, back in the 90s, and this is sort of the context, there was a time where we all loved each other. I don't think many of you young people know that. I'm not sure if you caused it, but from 2008 onward, life has gone sideways. So I grew up in the old times of the Cold War, right? So when I grew up as a kid, we knew the Russians were out there, and South Africa was the ally of the United States and the enemy of Russia. And that's why we see the policies we see in the ANC today as the exact reverse. And when we went at that time, the big fear was Russia was going to drop the bomb, and I grew up in New York. So one day I was 5 years old. I remember the sunset was kind of red. My brother goes to me, he was older than me, they dropped the bomb on New York, This is what we thought about growing up. In the Cold War, we thought it would never end. And then in the late 1980s, Ronald Reagan said, tear down this wall. And we looked at him, we said, Ronald Reagan, we love you dearly, but sometimes you're just clowning around. And then the whole wall fell. And once the wall fell, the Soviet Union didn't just leave Eastern Europe, but they even left themselves, and they gave up a few countries that they want back now, okay? So that was the way the world went. But at that time, things changed. We decided that we wanted a global world, and the U.S. was sort of a leader in that global world because we all thought everybody was good, and George Bush, the senior, not the junior, and we go out. And at that time, it was world trade, and free travel. The age of globalization had begun. And so in that time, the U.S. was trying to lift Eastern Europe. And they said, look, these countries have collapsed. We want them to grow. And if they have growth, and they have vibrant democracies, and they're financially viable, then we will have a world of peace and trade. Because we loved trade at that time. Because trade was America. And remember, America dominates the sea, right? We are a naval power. We are we don't want to say it too loud, we are the successor of the UK. But we're a little more quiet, you know? And the bottom line was that's who we were, and we were proud of that, and the world trade was good, and we wanted the seas. So in that analysis, you go, what the hell does that have to do with where my life is? The U.S. would send advisors abroad. And so they had a program, the U.S. Treasury Advisory Program, in which they were sending technical advisors to help rebuild Eastern Europe. And one set of advisors were tax people. Because you need, if you're going to have a viable country, we may not love it, but you need a tax system. So even the United States, just to go into further back history, before I grew up that was, 1770s, America set up, when we became free of the British, we had something called the Articles of Confederation. So we told the British, we don't like you because no taxation without representation. What we meant was no taxation. So we got rid of the British with the help of the French. Oddly enough, we liked each other too at that time. And so we rebelled against them. We set up the Articles of Confederation, but the federal government had no power to tax. And so there was a guy, Alexander Hamilton. There's Hamilton the musical, if you want to see it, in New York. And he was saying, you can't have a government without tax. And so that was the same thing. You got rid of communist countries, but now they need revenue to survive. And that was the same thing in Africa, because you'll see we need donor money because we can't raise money. So the U.S. had a Treasury program where they sent tax policy advisors abroad to help the various governments. And they were connected to the academics. And for some weird way, which is another story, I fell into this group. And I was interested. I said, I'm a professor. Look, we always get the summers off. We get a lot of time off. It's a good deal being a professor. I recommend it highly, all right? In the United States, here they don't pay you anything. Nothing. Less than nothing. And it's no fun. So different issue. So you have a summer off, and I said, okay, well, you want me in this program. Okay, I was talking to them a while. I thought I was going to go to Eastern Europe. And they called me up and they say, you know, you're going to South Africa. What about that? I said, okay. And they said, no, there's not just lions and tigers. I said, I know that. There are people there. It's an advanced economy. There's the Krugerrand and all that stuff. And they said, well, that's great. I think I'll go for 3 months for the summer. And they go, no, we want you to go for 4 years. So I said, 4 years? You know, I'm a professor. You know, I've got a nice, safe life. And I was trying to build my resume or whatever. And then, okay, divorce story comes in. I'm in the middle of the first divorce. So you're in the middle of divorce, and my friend's going to me, why do you want to be here? You've got no kids, whatever. Why don't you just go for it? So I decided to go for it, and I came here for 4 years originally. So I came in the first year, and that time we remember a great minister, Manuel, who I must say really, you know, we could use him in the United States. He was really, I think probably the best minister this country ever had in finance. And really, when they talk about the Mbeki years, I really call them the Minister of Manual Finance years. That's why we were doing so well. And he had Maria Ramos. And at that time, again, we all loved each other. And they wanted the U.S. people to come in. And they were very open to foreign advisors. So not only did I come, there was a patch of IRS advisors. There were Canadian advisors. I must recommend Canadian people highly. They're a little bit, they're Americans without the edginess, you know. They're a nice group of people, but the Australians were coming in, and we were all advising the government. Now, at that time, from an immigration perspective, I was outside of your system because I had a U.S. Special Diplomatic Pass, which was very nice. And I was able to get in the country, and they set me up, and that was year one. And I was there in year one, and we introduced some very favorite things that you enjoyed today. Capital gains tax, I know you love that. You know, certainly your clients really enjoy it. And then the other one that we introduced, and that's why I came in, they had decided to introduce worldwide tax. So when I was there, I was the implementer of it. So you won't blame me for the idea, you blame my other predecessor who brought this in. And so we wanted worldwide tax. Now remember, one thing about worldwide tax, even though people don't like it, that was the quid pro quo for the removal of exchange control. So exchange control was to be reduced, and it has reduced quite significantly, except for big companies. Really what they're worried about is they don't want big companies leaving. If they can solve that problem, you would eliminate exchange control. But individuals, you can move the money around. Of course, now you're harassed by gray listings and all other things, but that's a different thing. So there's a form of world exchange control going on. But at that time, the door was open. Worldwide tax comes in because our people are supposed to go around the world, and the people out there are supposed to come in. And so I was there, and so the system was set up, and I was there for a year, and at the time, the Treasury was trying to be stronger. And then I met my second wife, which worked out for a little while. I'll say South African girls are a lot better than American girls. Let me just leave it at that. I don't think she had enough South African in her at the end of the day, but let's leave that. So the point was, I had a good relationship with the Treasury, and I went from the U.S. Treasury and then joined the National Treasury of South Africa. And at that time, when now we get to the issue of immigration, we had an old immigration system, which was a lot more open than the one we have today, okay? We went from, I literally got in under the door. Within about 6 months, I became a permanent resident to South Africa. And I was really lucky. Now, I had a little help from the inside, but at that time, when you want to deal with home affairs, you could actually go in behind the counters into the offices and talk to friendly, accessible people. And so they went through, and I had a bunch of little things going on there. I had a few little wrinkles. Some of the wrinkles were U.S. So, for example, you needed an FBI report, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, who we used to think a lot highly of, but now is into cancel culture. Well, here was my problem with the FBI. I needed an FBI certificate that I'm not a criminal, okay? Now, I'm not sure why I already had the U.S. Treasury advisory stuff, but so you go to get it, and I send it in, and everything was going along fine, but I send it in, and then FBI is just not responding. I didn't know why. Well, what turned out was I sent in a $7 check, and I had made a mistake that I had to send a $5 check in. And they wouldn't accept the $7 check, and they needed a $5 check. And you can't just cancel a check. Whatever. We lost a month in converting $2 of check. So the reason why I mention that story is don't be too hard on your South African government officials. And the U.S. do it differently. They go, the way they always respond, I deal with the same at the U.S. Embassy here. They go, we understand what you're saying, sir. $7 versus $5. But these are the rules. I don't make the rules, but this is the way it has to be done. And I'm very sorry, but we need to work it out. And you get a very friendly face, but screw you. And that's the way it goes. So sometimes you have to talk to them a little bit. Okay, well, what can I do? Can I do it this way? And that's the only thing you can do with them. But it can be very, very bureaucratic. So I think people always think like in South Africa, you'll get this. We can't believe this is the worst country in the world. How can they possibly be this way? Go to some other countries, okay? And you should listen to some YouTubes. Like right now, the UK is falling apart. They're the worst. They're on permanent decline. It's the same all around the world. Same thing with the Revenue Service, okay? Now, I can't defend the Revenue Service too much because my members start to hate my guts. So I have to be very careful of that. But the Revenue Service is relatively strong next to revenue services around the world. Okay, I hope I don't quote me on that because I could get in trouble and I'll be booted out of the country. But they do a relatively good job. Yes, but they have a lot of problems. You listen to some of the things in the U.S., it's bizarre. So one thing in the U.S., for example, is we have e-filing. Now in the United States, I had to file a return, and I wanted to just file it by e-filing. And they told me, so you can't do it, the system is down. What do you mean, I can't file it and I can't pay by electronic means because the system's down? Okay, I said, will it be back in a week? They said, no, it's been down for 3 months and there'll be another month or two. I was like, what? What are you saying to me? And could you imagine Kieswetter, the e-filing system is down for 3 months, okay? It would be all over the news, you know, and there'd be explanations, and God only knows. So again, you've got to understand, look, each country is different, and I think one thing you're beginning to find in the world now, and you'll see that as well, and I'm seeing that in your numbers, people going abroad and coming back. There's definitely something there. But at that time in 2000, it was very different. So I managed to get under the door and under the wire for immigration. Now, it was very critical that I got it literally before, because literally a year later they changed the rules and they tightened them up extremely. The door was closed, you couldn't get access anymore, central offices, behind desks, everything. And one rule they introduced after me was that in order to become a permanent resident, you need a permanent job. If you don't have a permanent job, you don't have a permanent residence. Okay, that doesn't sound too unreasonable. But if you're at the Treasury, in order to get the permanent job, you have to have the permanent residence. Okay? Now, I just missed that by a little bit. And as much as my life has been crazy, and I've had my bad moments, I do believe the Lord is looking out after me. And I have a whole bunch of instances like that I literally missed that rule under 6 months in the wire. I had a successor who also joined the Treasury, and he was a little too late. It took him 10 years to resolve that bypass. And he had to actually threaten people and go high up to do it. He threw a major temper tantrum. Sometimes it's good to throw a major temper tantrum, by the way. I'm not that kind of guy. We'd be diplomatic, we do it this way, do that way. Every once in a while, there is something to be said for the major temper tantrum. But you've got to pull it in the right way, in the right moment to be effective. Unfortunately, too many of South Africans have a major emotional meltdown with some clerk, and they just burn themselves out. It's one of the problems when they deal with SARS is they have major emotional meltdowns. They call in God and country, how can the Revenue Service do this? And then they get blown away. So you reserve your hostility for that precise moment. And so he managed to get around that rule. They jimmied the rule for him. That's what they had to do. But I'm sure a lot of people are still stuck under that rule. So that was then. Then what I could see from immigration on your side, it just became really cold. It really became very, very difficult to bring in residents and all of that. At the same time, from a tax point of view, in the 2000s when we were there from the Treasury, is we were expanding the situation. And one of the things that we expanded was worldwide tax. Now in 2001, when we expanded worldwide tax, we had the rule that if you go abroad and you work abroad, that if you work abroad, all your services abroad are exempt from tax, period. And at that time, we had one nut in Treasury who wanted to shut that down. And Kosi Lo, the great man that he was, said, don't touch that rule. If people work abroad, leave them alone. And there was fights, and there were memos going back and forth, and then there was 6 months versus 12 months. This is the kind of crap that goes on. But these were pure government policy people, and their life was at stake over 6 versus 12 month and the policy rules that were there. So these things are flying around. But the point was we introduced worldwide tax, and so that was to say, look, if you leave, you're still in our net. And you'll see that policy went on for Treasury. A lot of times they were loosening the net one way, but the tax man comes up. So if you take money out of the country, you no longer have the pleasure of exchange control, but you now have the authorized dealer, which they didn't really understand that system. Deregulation means no authorized dealer, no reserve bank. Pushing it to the banks really has its own set of problems, especially in the corporate sector. And then they said, oh, there's Mr. Taxman now. So now you've got to go through the checks to take your money out that way. So it's not exchange control, it's a speed bump, right? But sometimes that bump is a little bit large, and some of it's procedural. And now I can explain that in a moment. So we went to a period there, but the door was, and I think Treasury was genuine, they don't want to, the Treasury is very reluctant to want to view South Africans as captives. And so that's what they were trying to do. And one of the issues they did want to do is they didn't want to see tax revenue going out the door. Because once you move to a worldwide tax system, you have that. So you go to a worldwide tax system, we worry about the abuses, but that's where we go in the system, and that's where we were, companies as well. So up to about 2007 and 2008, we were in a global world, except for South Africa on immigration, right? The U.S. was up, it's always been up and down in the U.S. People complain, but in America, at least up until a few months ago, the door was somewhat open. Our problem in America wasn't that we didn't mind legal immigration, we just didn't want illegal immigration. That's where we were. And I think one of the problems in this country's immigration policy is they're so busy restricting the legal, they're doing nothing about the illegal. So what is interesting is the ANC xenophobia, which it's there, it's ANC, is anti-European, anti-West. It really is. They don't want those Western people taking jobs. But I think the average person is more afraid of the Africans because those are taking their jobs. And that's typical in the world. And what you're seeing, like in America and Europe, it's the blue-collar worker. Those people are the ones. They're the jobs. And what happens is immigration does lower their wages. So we've got the wrong policy here, but one thing you know about the ANC, they're great at making laws and they're crappy at enforcing them, all right? And that I'm okay to say in the paper, okay? So we're in that world, but again, we moved along, and then by 2008, we had the Great Recession. And what we've seen is a growing grumpiness from that time, piecemeal. And what's happened then, first we lost a lot of money, so we were very, very angry at the banks, all of that. And there was an argument about the free flow of money. But what really happened was, after that event, we all were in trouble. All the governments around the world became heavily indebted. And when they were heavily indebted, they started to realize, with the 2008 recession, in order to avoid the Great Depression, they gave out a lot of money to avoid that Great Depression. So it was Great Recession. It wasn't that long. It wasn't like the 1930s for 10 years. But the government, to do that, they pumped the prime. So everybody's debt went up. Now they are 2012, 2013. That's when we began to see things change. And right at that point, the government said, wait a minute, we need money, but can we raise taxes? And the answer was no, because we were afraid of the people, right? To raise taxes is not a great way of being reelected, at least, except in South Africa. Somehow, whenever the revenue service beats its target, they get hailed. I don't know how the SARS, they beat their targets, they get more money out of people, and we all go, you're doing such a great job. Now, they are maybe for them doing a great job, but that's not something you would tout in the United States, that we beat our targets and we're taking in more money than ever. Then the commissioner would be out the door, even though that's what you should be doing. But the point was nobody was getting the money, and they couldn't raise taxes directly. We can't raise rates. So what do we do? And before then, too, even further, corporate tax was supposed to disappear. So there's a whole thing on that, not as relevant for you. So people envisioned a tax world of individuals and VAT. People I spoke to in the European governments, the tax people, they said, corporate tax is just not sustainable. And it all falls on the people anyway. Completely different model. So now they had to reverse their thinking. Now, you never want to raise taxes. What you want to do is go after evil people, right? It's not that we're raising taxes, it's that some of you are evil and not paying enough, okay? And that's the way politicians work. And you could see that in Prof and Gordon's speeches. So Trevor Manuel's days, that's one reason why I love them. Every year, he'd always tax the tobacco guys and the alcohol guys a little bit. I don't know what that was all about. He didn't like it because he liked to smoke cigars, but he did it reluctantly. That was his little thing. But overall, he announced every year, we're trying to reduce personal income tax rates. He was always adjusting, that PIT relief. And at that time, he was getting the rates lower, and he was trying to stimulate the economy. And his plan was a middle-class relief plan. What he was bothered was, we had an old regime where the rich got away with everything. There was no capital gains, there was nothing. And the guys in the middle, their salaries were being overtaxed. So when he was driving up their tax, he was worried about the middle-class worker and the lower middle. That's where we were going. And then when we started to run in trouble, like all the rest of the world, we ran out of money because we spent too much in 2000 and 2008 because Mr. Zuma decided to hire tons more government workers. Now, we thought he did it for the economy, but he did it for something else. And so then that changed the approach once again. And all of a sudden, we fell under pressure. And you saw Prof and Gordon trying to go after sin taxes and trying to go after evil people. And that's what all the politicians were doing. But you also began to see an anti-foreign sentiment pop up, that the foreigners are stealing from us. You'll see it, illicit flows was the word. So when you're a European intellectual, you don't say like Trump, you're cheating me, you're louses. That's how Trump speaks. They're illicit flows and they're legal people. And so all of a sudden, there's been a quiet anti-trade movement, anti-investment moving on. So I don't have too much time. I wish I could probably, I always think I don't have enough to talk about, and then I can talk forever. Just not sure what the hell it is, but maybe I was meant to be a professor. So the point is, we've now moved to a world where it's getting very tight, where it's coming down in your world now, and I've gone back to the United States, but I'm still a citizen there. I'm a dual citizen. By the way, you never want to be a citizen in the United States, because whether I'm here or there, I've been under their tax net regardless. So we are a unique brand of expat that we are subject to worldwide tax. We're like US residents. Treaties don't help us. Nothing helps us. There's a whole bunch of people complaining. So I'm in the systems. And then now what's happening is, I used to be, just quickly, is I was in the Treasury, then I was in an accounting firm. I'm the head of site. I was going to leave site, but now I'm still at site, but I'm also a professor. So that's just a quick footnote for those who want to know. But the point is, getting back and forth is becoming different now. So first it's hit the corporate world, but in your world now, what you're seeing is, yes, movements to, just like now, the DA is trying to open up home affairs. I know they're doing that. But the rest of the world is getting kind of tight. They're going the other way. And also what you're seeing in your world, there's that global mobility. And in the global mobility space, buying citizenship by investment, people wanting to go around, increasingly you're seeing like the UK, they eliminated the non-dom regime. That was pretty stupid. They certainly didn't get any revenue out of it. But it's the theory. Well, that's the problem with government officials. They love theory. They don't love reality. So what you're finding is that these citizenship by investment programs, you're seeing all these things quietly, the evil rich expat floating around. It isn't so easy anymore. Oddly enough, in South Africa, I think legal immigration is becoming a little easier. But I'm sure you're getting more trouble on the other side. Similarly, the other flow about financial flows, and this is something else Trump did. Trump wrote remember this trade formula he came up with? This trade formula that he had, it was written by amateurs. I've never seen such amateurishness that they made a calculation that if we have more imports versus your imports, we're going to put a tariff on you. They just looked at the flows. So Lesotho had a 41% tariff, I think, because actually there was no imports from the United States, and if there was, it was coming through South Africa, right? So it was completely amateurish, but they represented what people don't want. They are trying to stop cash going out of the country. So that's why you have all those know your client rules now. So sure, you can set up in Seychelles. It's wonderful. But nobody will let you take the money out of there. Your bank account doesn't work. So we're now in a world where you're worried, there's this nitty-gritty, And there's always a theory that there's somebody evil and you're not one of them. That's where we are now, and it makes it a very difficult process. And so immigration is not something an individual can do on their own, which is good, it keeps you busy. But if they're too strict, then you can't help them. So I think he's looking at me, Jeremy's like, I don't want you to speak anymore. So I think I'm going to call it on that, and thank you for listening.